couple right here as well, so I already had plenty. So we are in the third set of speeches of Job. We picked back up, and last week, after Jimmy had taught for a few weeks there, we started back in, and we got through a couple chapters there dealing with Eliphaz and Job's response to him, at least part of Job's response in chapter 23. So we're going to pick up in 24, and we'll see how far we get today. So if one of you guys wants to read Job chapter 24 for us, we'll pick up there and have a little discussion on that part.
Job chapter 24. Why does the Almighty not see times for judgment? Why must those who know him look in vain for such days? There are those who move boundary stones, they pasture flocks, they have stolen. They drive away the orphan's donkey, and they take the widow's ox in pledge. They thrust the needy from the path and force all the poor of the land into hiding. Like wild donkeys in the desert, the poor will go about their labor of foraging for food. The wasteland provides food for their children. They gather fodder in the fields and glean in the vineyards of the wicked. Lacking clothes, they spend the night naked. They have nothing to cover themselves in the cold. They are drenched by mountain rains and hug the rocks for lack of shelter. The fatherless child is snatched from the breast of the infant, the poor is seized for debt. Lacking clothes, they go about naked, they carry their sheaves, but they still go hungry. They crush olives among the terraces, they tread the wine presses, yet suffer thirst. The groans of the dying rise from the city, and the souls of the wounded cry out for help. But God charges no one for wrongdoing. There are those who rebel against the light, who do not know its ways or stay in its paths. When the daylight is gone, the murderer rises up, kills the poor and needy, and in the night steals forth like a thief. The eye of the adulterer watches for dusk. He thinks, no eye will see me, and then he keeps his face concealed. In the dark, thieves break into houses, but by day they shut themselves in. They want nothing to do with the light. For all of them, midnight is the morning. They make friends with the terrors of darkness. Yet they are foam on the surface of the water. Their portion of the land is cursed, so that no one goes to the vineyards. As heat and drought snatched away melted snow, so they gave snatches away to those who have sinned. The womb forgets them, the worm feasts on them. The wicked are no longer remembered, but are broken like a tree. They prey on the barren and the childless woman, and and to the widow they show no kindness. But God drags away the mighty by his power. Though they become established, they have no assurance of life. He may let them rest in a feeling of security, but his eyes are on their ways. For a little while they will be exalted, and then they are gone. They are brought low and gathered up like others, like all others. They are cut off at the knees, at the heads of grain. If this is not so, who can prove me false and reduce my words to nothing?
All right. So Job here starts to question why God has not set appointed days to judge the wicked. And he starts to catalog the unjust practices of the wicked who take advantage of others. And what's interesting here, like what we talked about last week, Eliphaz, do you remember Eliphaz has now spoken 3 times. And in his first speech, what does he do? What does he do as far as what does he accuse Job of doing? Yeah, just something wrong, right? He's done something wrong. Then in his second speech, he kind of starts going a little further, and he kind of says, like, maybe, I'm paraphrasing again here, but maybe you did this, or maybe you did that. Then what did he do in this third speech that whenever he talks to Job. Yeah, he starts saying, you did this and you did that. Like, he's elevated from, maybe you did this, maybe you did something, and then like, maybe this is what you did, and get a little more specific, and now it's like, you did this, this, and this. Of course, did Job do any of what he's saying that Job did? No, he didn't. So he's just making stuff up, basically, at this point, to win his argument. We talked a little bit about, like, how do we see that happening today? And we won't go into that, but we see that in lots of places, right? So here, whenever Job starts to respond in chapter 23, he doesn't really even respond to Eliphaz's accusations. He starts talking about how he wishes he could talk to God and bring his case before God. But now in 24, he kind of circles back, and he's not really answering the accusations, but he kind of says, wait a second. And and some of the things he names here are kind of similar to what Eliphaz has accused him of doing. Like if you look at, some remove landmarks, they seize and devour flocks. Well, that Eliphaz had said, you've taken things that don't belong to you. Like he kind of indirectly is answering Eliphaz's accusations, not saying I didn't do it. He's not like, he doesn't feel the need any longer to try to say I didn't do these things that you're accusing me of, but he does say, wait a second, people who do that, what happens to them? And what does he say?
We ought to live a long time before anything happens.
Yeah, what you're saying isn't right. These people that would move landmarks in order to increase the size of their lands, people who steal the land and flocks of orphans and widows, people who force others to hide to escape further injustice. All these people, and I'll go down and do a little bit more on those, but all the things that these people do, what you're saying happens to them isn't happening. That's not the case. What are some other things that he says that they would do? Well, they would, the poor would end up being homeless, having to wander around and forage for food. Once again, going back, Eliphaz accused Job of not taking care of these people. The poor would end up having to work for the wicked. They would not have warm clothing and would have nowhere to go to get out of the rain. So he's just using pictures or things that are happening to emphasize what he's talking about. They would take the fatherless children from their mothers and children from the poor as collateral for debt. They would cause the poor to be naked and hungry, and they wouldn't forgive them their debts. And then they would make the poor work for them, but they wouldn't give them proper pay. So basically, once they were poor, they were stuck in that. Now, then that's something that's kind of important, because here in America, we don't get that. When you're in that society, when you're poor, you're stuck. There's not much of a way that you're going to move from being poor to being rich. There was no mechanism. In America, we have opportunity to bridge that gap. There's a lot of people that don't, and we still have poor. So don't get me wrong, I'm not saying there's not poor, but there's opportunity to move from poor to middle class to rich. They didn't have that. So they just beat down the poor even more so. The poor would make stuff, they would produce it, but they didn't get to take any of it. It all went to those who, to the owners or the wealthy. And Job wonders why God doesn't pay any attention to all this mistreatment, to all of this happening. And so that's kind of how he answers Eliphaz. Yeah.
But he does pay attention.
Right, yeah, and Job kind of comes around to that then. Well, before we get there, in 13 through 17, verses 13 through 17, Job describes the character of those who go unpunished by God and how they go about their wickedness. And what's the basic gist of what he's saying they do? They hide it, right? They do it under cover of night. They have secret paths to avoid the light, to have it shown on them. They believe they can perform their evil acts without being seen. Of course, can they? From people. Yep.
They can be seen.
but their acts can be seen by God. Yeah. So so Job comes back now, and in 18 through 25, now he seems to refute what Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar have said. And we can go back and kind of read that in conjunction with some of what they said. If you go back to Job 5:3, and actually before I go back there, so what does he say? He says that he seems to indicate that they will be brought to justice at some point. Because he says, in 20 especially, he starts talking about a mother will forget him. The worm feeds sweetly till he is remembered no more, and wickedness will be broken like a tree. So at that point, he kind of starts talking about, well, what are the repercussions and what will happen at this point. Job is saying that their view, if their view is correct, the wicked should already be being punished. And it wouldn't just be me, is what Job's saying. It wouldn't just be, I'm not the only one that would be being punished. Look at all these other people. And it is a little bit difficult because Job, and what he's saying here, kind of sometimes goes back and forth between talking about what the wicked person's doing, what the righteous person's doing, and then what the result will be. But Wayne Jackson, one of the books that I was reading, he says that in spite of the present prosperity of the wicked, Job is saying they will finally be brought down. And although God appears to preserve them by his power, in reality they have no assurance of life. Their prosperity will be short-lived. But if you compare that to what his friends had said, go back to Job 5:3. Where Eliphaz says, I have seen the foolish taking root, and I cursed his abode immediately. His sons are far from safety. They are even oppressed in the gate. Neither is there a deliverer. So Eliphaz is saying that the wicked don't have a deliverer, that they are, which they don't, but that they're being punished. And then in 18:16 through 20, Bildad is saying, here again in relation to the wicked, his roots are dried below and his branches cut off above. Memory of him perishes from the earth, and he has no name abroad. He is given from light into darkness and chased from the inhabited world. He has no offspring or posterity among his people, nor any survivor where he sojourned. Those in the west are appalled at his fate, and those in the east are seized with horror. There again indicating that all these bad things are happening to the wicked. Once again, is that true? In a manner of speaking, yes, but not in the way that he's referring to it. Actually, he's pretty specifically, Bildad there is pretty specifically calling out Job. He's talking about Job, the men from the west and the east and all that, is in reference to Job.
That's something I think that mankind needs to really work on, and that is patience of God. It will happen in time.
Right. Well, and as we've discussed and laying the groundwork for all this discussion, we talked about how there's no certainty, and we'll see that even more so here. There's no what's the saying that we have? The rain falls on the just and the unjust, and it's not just God isn't calling out every sin you're going to be punished in this way, or every time you do a righteous act you're going to be rewarded in this way. There's no guarantees on any of that, because if there was, then the world wouldn't function in the way God wanted it to function. He wants it to be where we have the choice of whether we obey him or not, whether we choose to follow him. And if we were rewarded every time we did right and we were punished every time we did wrong,
That'd make it so much easier.
yeah, it would make it a lot easier, wouldn't it? Yeah, you wouldn't have to, there wouldn't be the temptation as much to do wrong because you get punished right away, right? That's the whole point of it, is that we have the choice, the free will to choose what we're going to do. So if things were the way Job's friends, and I always when I say friends, I always cringe because are they his friends? I don't know. But anyway, every time these people who are talking to Job, his associates, if what they are arguing was correct, then it wouldn't serve God's purpose. Where would the choice be if that were the case?
The whole book of Job
Uh-huh.
with the devil going, hey, you just bless him because he's good.
Yeah. Or he just follows you because you've blessed him so much. Yeah, whichever way you want to argue that, yeah. So anyway, you know, if you go back through Job, you can see where they're calling out all these things where it's like, well, the evil are punished. And Job's like, no, that's not the case. But even beyond that, the righteous aren't rewarded in many cases, right?
In a lot of cases, because if you're looking at the Bible, how many widows do you have to oppress?
We're just talking sheer numbers.
Right.
Before it's wicked.
Yeah. How much of this do you have to do before it becomes wicked?
Yeah, and you look at at everything listed in the Bible, there seems to be an awful lot of wickedness going on in the world. Now, of course, we don't have that today.
Yeah.
But you go outside the house, you don't even have to go outside. People are trying to get inside.
Oh yeah, you want to see wickedness, you can turn on the TV anytime you want. And,
I gave that up years ago, thank you.
So, yeah, that's very true. I mean, it's just, nothing's changed. As we talked about, nothing's changed. People, you still have wicked people. I mean, things don't change, just our view of it changes with the limited amount of what we get to see in our lives. Of course, then in verse 25, then he says, now if it is not so, who can prove me a liar and make my speech worthless? So he challenges them basically to prove him wrong on what he's saying. So a couple of things to consider about what Job said here. Going back to I must have written down the wrong verse here because, yeah. 24:22, yeah, I wrote down 23. But 24:22 says, but he drags off the valiant by his power. He rises, but no one has assurance of life. As we were saying, life is uncertain. Nobody has assurance. Tragedy can strike at any moment. And we've talked about that. What purpose do natural disasters have in the world? You know, does it matter if you have a mansion out in Beverly Hills or whatever, if it gets destroyed by an earthquake or a flood or, well, that wouldn't be a flood there, earthquake or whatever, fire would be more likely, I think, there. So, the fact that these things are always possibilities should help us to realize that we don't have certainty in anything here on earth. It can be taken away at any time. And then, of course, life is short. We know that, and he emphasizes that. And then, if you go to James, I think that's one of the best passages to talk about how the brevity of life. For James 4:14. Yet you do not know what your life. Well, I was start in 13. Come now, you who say today or tomorrow, we shall go to such and such a city and spend a year there and engage in business and make a profit. Yet you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. You are just the vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and also do this or that. But as it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. Therefore, to one who knows to do the right thing and does not do it, to him it is sin. That passage, does it mean that every time we say, oh, a year from now I'm going to do this, that we ought to say, Lord willing, and the creek don't rise, as my parents always said? I don't think it means that your mindset ought to be that we know that that's not guaranteed. We make plans for the future, but we know that there's no certainty in that. And we need to be aware of that. All right, so let's go on to chapter 25. And DP, you got a long one to read here, I think.
Then Bildad the Shuhite replied, dominion and awe belong to God. He established in order the heights of heaven. Can his forces be numbered? On whom does his light not rise? How can then a mortal be righteous before God? How can one be born of woman be pure, even if the moon is not bright, the stars are not pure in his eyes? How much less is a mortal who is a maggot, a human being who is only a worm?
All right, so Bildad here, maybe he decides that he can't respond to Job very well. I'm not sure exactly why he says what he does here, but you know that Job's friends have been speaking their minds and running roughshod over him instead of considering his feelings, as we've been discussing for the last several weeks. And we can see the devastation that a quick tongue can bring. You know, we talked about that, like being where, when you get into discussions and things, first off, keep in mind what the situation is, whether it makes sense to actually have a theological discussion with someone given their circumstances or whatever. Sometimes it may not. Be aware of that. And then also be aware of what you're saying and whether you have all the facts. Don't make assumptions, all those kind of things. You know, they spoke with a lot of subtlety, right? Maybe not so much, maybe more like a rocket blast or something. But instead of helping Job, each time they were reloading and firing with greater intensity. They kept on ramping it up. But Bildad's final speech, some people think that this continues the attack on Job, and you can certainly read it that way, that it's saying, you're a worm, you know, kind of thing. But I could also read it well, actually, I should say that, you know, some of the books that I was reading indicate that, but I could also read it almost as a surrender of, okay, I'm not going to be able to convince you of this. You know, Bildad declares that God has absolute sovereignty, and that he cannot be resisted, and that his power should cause all people to be in awe. Bildad says that God establishes peace and order and his heights, and basically God puts everything together and causes it to work. His power is limitless. Is that true?
Yes and no.
There's always a caveat, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, look, can you resist God? Yeah, I can tell him, no, I'm not interested. He gave me the power to refuse him.
Right.
That's a lot of power. I mean, I don't think, we don't tend to think in terms of the proper place that God's put us in. You know, we go to Genesis, he gives man dominion over the earth. I'm sorry, what's dominion mean? You rule. He's given you that power and that authority. Can he take it away? Yeah, in a heartbeat, literally, okay? But can we resist God? People do all the time.
Well, it all comes from, here again, the point of view of what you're looking at. Is God all-powerful, and does that description fit? Yes, it does. We've talked about that. Does all-powerful mean that he can do anything? Yes and no. He can't deny himself, as it talks about in other scriptures, and because he's established the world the way he has, you know, my favorite thing example to use is can he create a four-sided triangle? You know, yes and no. Yeah, he could, and by doing so, he would break all of the laws that he's established, and you know, you could go down and do any kind of example like that. So, yes, God can do anything, but there's limits on it because of what he's established. And specifically in relation to us, he's given us free will, which once again goes back to, why does evil exist? Because we have free will. That's why it exists. So yeah, Bildad's correct in his thinking again. And what if he's coming at it from the point of trying to say to Job, well, God's all-powerful and you're nothing in his sight and you're just a worm, then no, he's not right. I mean, that would be an incorrect way of interpreting it. If he's truly saying God's all-powerful and giving God respect, then I would say yes, that's good. You know, and then in verse 4 through 6, Bildad, here again, depending on how you see it, but he rebukes Job by declaring that no mortal person can stand before a holy God and claim to be righteous. So if he's directly responding to Job's claims of not having committed these sins, then he's saying, he's just attacking him again and saying, yeah, your argument doesn't work. Once again, is he correct? Yeah, because we can't go before God and claim righteousness over God. But if he's going from the, was Job a righteous person? That's what started this whole thing, going back to what Charles said, all right? That devil comes before God and says, well, actually God says, look at my servant Job, and the devil says, well, that's only because of how you blessed him. So that's what starts the whole thing. So Bildad asks, how can a man be righteous before God, and how can he be clean who is born a woman? And the implied answer is you can't. At least that's the implication. And he talks about the moon and the stars not being bright and pure in God's sight. They were pale in comparison to God's light. Or maybe he's saying that God's light is like the sun versus people who are like the moon and the stars. If the sun's out, you can't see them. Either way, he talks about us being maggots and worms, and that's a translation of the Hebrew word rima, which describes worms associated with decay, so decaying. And then he uses another word, Hebrew word talia, and is a reference to larva or grub, and that's used to communicate weakness or insignificance. So all communicating that we're lower than God. Some people use Job 25:4 to teach the doctrine of original sin or inherited sin, because it says, how then can man be just with God, or how can he be clean who is born a woman? So if you take that phrase, you can say you're born, so you're unclean when you're born.
So, this is one of those things that just kind of irritate me in life. So, God says, be holy because I'm holy. So, did God set us up for a fail? My opinion is no. Peter will say, you have not suffered because you haven't given up sin.
Right.
So, can a person be righteous? Or did God set you up for an immediate
For failure, right.
My opinion, and everybody can go ahead and throw stones later. Yeah, you can be righteous because God said you can. He built you with that ability. Otherwise, what's the point of Jesus coming as an example? He's righteous, so he says, I'm the example, so follow me. Well, why should I follow you? Because I'm just a man, so of course I'm sinning. No, stop it.
Right, yeah, it's no excuse to just be for that. Yeah, and as we talked about, when you mentioned that, I forget where we were along in the line, but when you mentioned that, yeah, we can discuss whether it's possible for a person to live a perfect life or not. We know that Jesus did it. And that's where we have our hope, is that we know that Jesus did it. And whether we can get in debates about all the other stuff, that we're not going down, but yeah. But as far as that goes, but yeah.
It just struck me when you were talking about Job and his friends talking about his relationship to God, and it just struck me as how interesting it is that in the Old Testament, like Jesus isn't involved in that discussion at all, right? And so sometimes it can be complicated for us when we're dealing with the Old Testament because Jesus really isn't even part of that conversation.
Actually, he kind of is. Job just doesn't realize that he is whenever he's calling out for the mediator and the arbiter. Yeah.
Yeah, could that have anything to do with the uncleanness of the birth situation? When a boy or girl, the one was unclean for so many days, and the girl was so many days. I'm just wondering if that process would have anything to do with verse 4.
Well, I don't think Bildad would have anything like that on that, because at this point, we think that Job was a contemporary of Abraham, so that would be prior to that law being set up. But I think it's just the whole thing of people. Like we're unclean, we're impure before God. It's kind of the point that he's trying to make. And first off, is Bildad inspired? No. So first off, anything that Bildad says can't be used to support a doctrine of inherited sin or anything for that matter, because all that's, now then whoever wrote it we think is inspired, but as far as what Bildad is saying, he's not necessarily inspired. So it can't be used to support that kind of a doctrine, first off. But second, I think he's not really, that's not even under consideration. Yeah, that's not, he's just talking, he's using it as an example for God being, man being so much lower, people being lower than God. Yeah, I wasn't even thinking something along those lines. So to try to argue that is taking something very much out of context with it, So, and this goes back to what Charles was saying, can someone be righteous on their own without God? No, because you have to follow, first off, you have to follow God's commands to be righteous, right? So we can't just do it on our own. You have to have knowledge of what God wants. Now, whether you can carry it out perfectly, which is, I think is kind of what you're getting at, that, like I said, that's a whole nother topic, and you can debate that, whether a person could live a perfect life or not. The one we know lived a perfect life is Jesus.
He was a man after God's own heart, even,
Right, yeah.
But that was not perfection.
Right, David was not perfect by any stretch. We know that. But he was, he lived. He was a man after God's own heart. So we can only be justified before God in the way God has designed, by what God tells us. All right, so why do you think Bildad's, I kind of talked a little bit about it, but why do you think Bildad's speech is so short here? He's run out of things to say?
Well, I think he's looking at Job going, you can't figure this out. You're so engrossed in what you're doing. There's no getting through to you.
Yeah, he's given up on convincing Job, maybe. Or the other thought is maybe Job's convinced him a little bit. But I don't think that's correct, but there is that, at least a little bit of a possibility there that's happened. Okay, so I guess we've kind of been covering this, but do you agree with what Bildad has to say in this final? Yes and no. Yeah. Could Job disagree with what Bildad had said about God having sovereign power over man, over people? No, he couldn't really. But what had Bildad forgotten? What isn't he mentioning here? Does God want us to be lost? Does God want to punish us? No. So he's forgotten God's grace and salvation. He's totally focused on the depravity of people. At this point, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar seem to be saying there's nothing people can do to be saved. Does that sound like something you've heard maybe some other doctrines out there?
Oh, there's some doctrines out there, you betcha.
Yeah. So they're pretty much saying, of course, they don't realize that their very arguments would condemn them as well and would condemn everybody, and that it just doesn't work with the situation. But regardless, there are doctrines that there's nothing you can do to be saved. Either you're saved or you're not, and we got to be careful to try to be aware of that, to try to teach people, no, you can be saved. It doesn't matter what you've done. We talked about that too. What's happening in the religious and the Christianity today? Come as you are. Everybody's accepted. Do we say that? Well, we do in a way. We want you to come as you are, come and be here, but we teach you got to follow God's word. Whereas a lot of these groups now are just saying, come, we don't care, you just keep doing whatever you're doing. Whatever it is, whatever sin you're committing, whatever you're doing in your life, doesn't matter. We could name off a few, but it doesn't matter. We won't go into the specifics here, but they don't care. It's just come. God accepts you as you are. Well, God wants you to come to him, but there again, what part are they forgetting about our role? Repentance? Yeah, exactly. So there's been so much error taught out there. Whenever we're talking with people, we got to realize that they may not be coming from the same place we are when we're talking about this. They may not realize their need to be saved. They may not realize that they can be saved. They may think that it's an either or and it's already done. Or they may not realize that what they're doing is sin, because so many people aren't teaching what sin is anymore. Yeah.
We need to remember that we were once in their shoes.
Right. Yeah. Well, if you're not a Christian, if you don't belong to God, we're in their same place. Yeah.
Sometimes we forget that we were in their shoes at one time. We were lost, and
Yep.
we kind of get our nose bent out of shape sometimes, I think.
Yep. And here again, what he forgot: humans aren't maggots and worms in God's eyes. That's not. Humans were created in God's image. In fact, let us create man in our image. So we are valuable to God. And as I mentioned, he seems not to realize that the argument he's using for all the things that, or I should say not just Bildad, but his friends, that all these calamities that Job's undergone, and they're saying, well, this is because of how bad you are, that would apply to everybody. And it doesn't work just to argue that for him. and they couldn't figure that out. All right, I really thought that with the length of chapter 25 that we get into 26 today, but I talked too much. So we will pick up with 26 next week, and then the next section here, Job has 5 chapters where Job's talking. I'm only going to cover 26, and then we'll kind of go back and have a quiz on the 2 sections of speeches, because I always like to go back and just not going into the detail and reading and doing all that, but just kind of overarching, what do we get out of this section? What things do we need to learn, and what's important? So after we get 26, which hopefully won't take too long to go through, we'll hit that. And then after that, we're going to hit a section that I've never actually gone into in-depth study on myself, and that's what Elihu has to say and what God has to say. Of course, I've had classes on it and stuff like that, but I've never actually tried to teach anything with that. So it'll be interesting. We'll try to we'll hit Elihu and what Elihu has to say, and then what God has to say. I have no idea how long that'll take. We've been on Job for quite a while, but we'll see how long we go through that over the next few weeks. So, all right, we'll be back in 15 minutes.